Hey everyone, and welcome to the webinar, the second webinar in the Build Your Run series. I appreciate you guys taking some time out of your Sunday morning. I know a lot of people had some difficulties with this time, but hopefully those who could not attend can also watch the replay. Today I want to cover with the second webinar in the Build Your Run series, Strength Training and Plyometrics, a huge area when it comes to the endurance community, making sure we're doing those things behind the scenes to help and create a good foundation, improve performance, and also help reduce the risk of injury. So take a second, silence any cell phones, technology around you. A lot of obviously great information here. Going to reflect on some of the research and then go into the exercises, specific exercises, so you have some guidance moving forward. Somewhere on your screen, you should see a Q&A function. And take a second and click that. That is where you, throughout the webinar today, can input any questions, comments, anything you want me to clarify a little bit more. Some of those I will not answer immediately as you post them. If it's specific to what we're covering, I'll try to get to that to the best of my ability. If not, I'll definitely try to answer that in the Q&A or follow up with you directly the next day to make sure you have an actionable response. At the very end of the webinar, we'll be raffling off 1 free month in the Healthy Running Program. We'll talk about that a little bit more as we get to it. Just make sure, sometimes these open rates and actually getting these emails into the inbox is not as easy as people think. So you will be getting an email tomorrow around 11, 12 o'clock in the morning. Check your spam folder. It will have the replay. It will have the raffle winner and everything included there. Okay, so let's get started into the content. So what I want you to learn today from this webinar is the research behind strength training and plyometrics. So I know a lot of you have been on my webinars in the past. I don't like to just give here, do this. I want you to understand some of the research behind why we're doing the things we're doing. So hopefully you can make better decisions on your own, and in the future, hopefully not need me. You understand some of the research, some of the key principles that you can make the best decisions possible with your running. So we'll talk about some of the research behind strength training and plyometrics, the demands of running on the kinetic chain, some key training principles, which should make up the foundation of your program, some rules to follow, if you will. And then from there, what are the best exercises for runners? Obviously, this will be very individualized. When you're actually creating your own program, there could be a lot of different exercises that you include compared to myself or someone else. But just based on the research, based on what I see in my day-to-day working with runners, these are some of the best exercises that you could and should be implementing in some way. And then from there, we'll kind of wrap up with some good advice moving forward. As I mentioned today, we're covering the strength training and plyometrics topic. This is the second webinar in the series. I will be including the injury prevention link in the follow-up email tomorrow, so keep an eye on for that if you have not watched that webinar yet. But for those of you that were interested in using strength training to improve running mechanics, we'll touch on that a bit today, but we're going to go more specific in running mechanics in 2 weeks exactly from today, as we cover running mechanics, running form, and a lot of the research and information behind that. So that'll be the third webinar in our series. Before we get into the content, let me take a second to introduce myself. My name is Garrett McLaughlin. I'm a licensed athletic trainer, strength conditioning coach that works with runners, currently living in West Bloomfield, Michigan. I've been a lot of different places over the years, grew up in Boston, lived in Miami for a few years, Nashville, and now here to stay permanently in Michigan, which I'm definitely looking forward to. I help runners get faster, move better, reduce their likelihood of injury. There's a lot of different things that go into this based on evaluations, running analysis, movement assessments. Really look deep at the details to see what does each specific or individual runner need to see the best results and achieve their goals. It's very individualized based on that runner, depending on what you present with. So I like to really dig in when it comes to evaluations and assessments, and then creating programs, functional training, personal training, rehabilitation, soft tissue manual therapy called active release techniques. A lot of different strategies and ways to go about this, but trying to really find the best way to suit each specific individual. What to expect from the webinar today. We're going to start with just that background information, trying to really create a good foundation for you guys and really understand this topic better. We're going to review the background research behind strength training and plyometrics. What are the benefits you could potentially see from including these? And then talk about the demands of running, so we know exactly what we need to target within our programs for it to carry over to the sport specifically. Exercises, obviously a whole list of exercises I want to go through with you guys today with different video demonstrations, how to perform them correctly, why they're valuable, and how they will improve your running moving forward. And then kind of some key takeaways to hopefully implement these things as soon as possible within your routine. So what does the research tell us when it comes to strength training and plyometrics? We know from a performance standpoint, we can increase speed first and foremost. Some of these neuromuscular characteristics that you see there, like rate of force development, motor unit recruitment, some areas that we may not, you may not understand specifically, but how to target nerves and muscle fibers in a way that allow us to create force and explosiveness that translate to running faster. Time until exhaustion, obviously more of an endurance component there, could be muscular, could be cardiovascular, could be neuromuscular, preventing fatigue. Strength training is phenomenal for that. And then everything you see in the research, we look at the benefits of strength training. Almost every single research article says strength training plyometrics helps improve running economy. Okay. From an injury prevention standpoint, a little bit gray here. Those of you that attended the injury prevention webinar have heard some of this before. There's really no conclusive evidence showing that just strength training alone will reduce your risk of injury. What we do know about strength training is that it addresses a lot of the risk factors associated with injury. So we can target those key things that could potentially predispose you, but we really need to connect these worlds, strength training, plyometrics, and running mechanics together to see the best long-term results. We need to actually retrain the running pattern specifically. We'll talk about that more in a second. So from a performance standpoint, this is a great research article, and just kind of want to touch on some of the research that you see where I get this information from. A 40-week study, so showing the long-term benefits of including a strength training program. It showed that completing a strength training program for that period of time helped improve maximal and reactive strength. So looking at your absolute strength, power, those key underlying things that translate to performance. Running economy is always huge. I mean, we're always an area that we're trying to improve when it comes to running to see better results. It's a really good performance indicator. And then velocity at maximal oxygen uptake. What that means is when you're at your max as far as your aerobic threshold, using the maximum amount of oxygen as you run, you're pushing your limits, you can actually attain a faster speed at that limit, okay? So in more of a fatigued or high intensity state. So this study demonstrates that 40 weeks of strength training can significantly improve all of those qualities there. Very interesting here, and I think something I want to touch on for a second, without hypertrophy. So a lot of the runners that I work with, I see a lot of, especially women that come through that say, hey, I want to introduce strength training, I want to get faster, I want to reduce my likelihood of injury, I want to achieve these goals, but I've been told strength training makes me bulky, I'll gain muscle mass, I'll become slower because I'll be carrying more muscle. That's typically not the case when it comes to strength training for endurance athletes. You're doing so much activity that falls into that endurance range that really offsets some of these muscular adaptations that you'll see with strength training. And generally, most of the programs that I create for my clients are very full body focused. We're not just doing like a leg day, shoulder day, chest and back, which is more of a typical bodybuilding type program. They're very full body, so there's less volume on specific muscle groups, but focus more so on improving running overall without getting that increase in muscle mass. Another article here, another research article showed that strength training plyometrics improve some of these neuromuscular characteristics, like I mentioned before. Motor unit recruitment and targeting more muscle fibers, rate of force development. So that is getting a muscle and a tendon to contract more quickly and more powerfully, which translates to speed and performance. Running economy, again, consistent in the research. And then strength and rate of force development. So being more tolerant to the loads of running, being stronger, being able to withstand the demands a little bit better. So what they concluded, coaches should not hesitate to implement a well-planned periodized, which is important. Sorry, chat here. Periodized, CT means concurrent training program. So that is actually strength training and endurance training at the same time. It's a concurrent training program for endurance runners. From an injury prevention standpoint, again, like I mentioned, very interesting, very gray area when it comes to, does strength training actually prevent injury. One thing we need to realize, we cannot, with the injury rates being so high and it's such a demanding sport on the body, we cannot prevent injury altogether, although we can offset the risk to some degree. But this recent article from, it was actually from the 2019 New York City Marathon, showed that, and again, take this with a grain of salt, a kind of a general 12-week strength training program. So they gave the 12-week strength training program to one group of runners. They studied a separate group of runners to see, okay, is the group of runners that are actually going through the 12-week strength training program, are they less likely to become injured? And then also, are they able to improve performance as a result of that training program? Why I have an issue with some of the research, it's very general. Again, these things need to be individualized, but I understand it's hard to do that with some of these research studies. What they found in the research was there was a very high rate of injury among first-time marathoners. So something important to know is when you're trying to run a longer distance, if you're going from a half marathon, you're going to run your first marathon, or if marathon, you're trying to go to ultra, there's always a greater injury risk involved in that. So being smart about how you progress through your program. And what they did find with this research study was it did not decrease overuse injury, resulting in non-completion of the marathon. So those that completed the 12-week program, those that did not, they had very similar. It was actually within about a 1% difference between the two. So it was not significant, showing that just completing a 12-week strength training program reduced the likelihood of injury. But we'll kind of talk about why that is with this next one. So another study here, two very good researchers that focused very heavily on runners, physical therapy, biomechanics. What they did was put a series of runners through a running analysis, and then through a movement assessment, looking at the single leg squat. So single leg squat is a movement that very specific to running. It's on one leg. It requires balance, stability, alignment, and a lot of hip strength to perform adequately. And then they said, okay, we're going to put them through a 6-week program to improve their performance on that single leg squat, and then see what happens in terms of running form and running mechanics after that. What they found was throughout the 6-week program, they did a great job actually improving the single leg squat itself. So they improved alignment, pelvic stability, hip abductor, hip external rotator strength, but there was no actual change to running mechanics. So what we tend to believe here, when you look at some of these studies that say, hey, this strength training program didn't reduce the likelihood of injury, we need to try to do a better job of combining strength training to address those key components. But then at the same time, if you have any type of abnormal movement patterns, poor running form, running mechanics, you need to address those as well. So we want to address the risk factors and then be able to express it as we run by running more efficiently and effectively. Okay, so combining strength training with some kind of running retraining is the kind of the consensus on the research right now from an injury prevention standpoint. Some of the risk factors that we want to target when it comes to strength training, first and foremost, previous injury. I've talked to a few people about this over the last week alone. Sometimes you'll see a lot of runners that will have some kind of injury, will rest, will reduce mileage, will get over that injury, but never go through a formal rehab process to really target what was the reason behind why I suffered that injury in the first place. A previous injury is a very strong determinant of a future injury. So making sure you fully go through that rehab process, you rehab that properly, you address whatever the underlying issues were that created that problem in the first place, because that's going to definitely increase your risk of suffering from that injury in the future. Other things include overpronation, atypical foot patterns. Again, I hear from a lot of people say, I pronate. Which to pronate is a natural shock absorption pattern from running. We should actually pronate as that foot comes down when you strike while running, but are we overpronating or are we pronating too quickly? Those are two things that will increase your risk of injury. Looking at more so at the pelvis, stability and levelness of the pelvis, another area which as you're standing or landing on the right leg, that left side pelvis should drop a little bit, about 3 degrees. If we're dropping more than that, that has been linked with a lot of different injuries, medial tibial stress syndrome, IT band, hip bursitis, hip tendinopathy. From there, looking at hip abduction, hip internal rotation, knee valgus. So pretty much alignment and positioning of the leg. Is that leg more turned inward? Is the knee collapsing in as I run, or am I able to maintain a nice, stable, aligned position? Muscle weakness is always one. Again, not necessarily am I just a weak runner, but do I have any kind of imbalances or differences from side to side? Do I have any weakness potentially in the glute that's overstressing the hamstring? Is one left side weaker than the right side? Those are the key things we need to tease out here to make sure we're balanced as much as possible. And then lastly, some of these age-related disorders, so looking at osteopenia and osteoporosis, which are just overall levels of bone mineral density, something that tends to decline as we age, specifically for white females. So making sure you're adding some kind of plyometrics, jumping, landing, strength training to load the bones in a nice healthy way to maintain and prevent the loss of bone mass. And then sarcopenia, another thing, we tend to lose obviously muscle mass as we age as well. So making sure we're preserving that to the best of our ability, so we're able to be just as tolerant to the demands of running. Now, getting into that, demands of running. We tend to really underestimate or underappreciate how demanding the sport is. I think we know it's a hard sport, but we don't really know to what degree. Running is a single leg plyometric-like activity. Single leg, again, very important thing to understand, and that we should reflect within our strength training program. Plyometric-like, pretty much bounding and jumping from one leg to another in a controlled fashion. So there is this power component to it, which can tendons and muscles come into play to a greater degree to make sure we're explosive and we're forceful as we're pushing off. That translates to better speed and performance. Running, though, is a very predictable movement and loading pattern, which tends to get a lot of runners into trouble. If you're completing the same movement over and over and over again, you tend to develop these overused patterns as a result of that. So teaching the body how to move in multiple planes of motion is awesome within your strength training program. Are we moving laterally? Are we rotating? Even though they're not specific to the sport itself, we want to really create this foundation of good athletic movement as our foundation, and then build running on top of that, okay? Running, some of the ground reaction forces you'll see while running and striking the ground, foot strike and throughout that stance phase, can be anywhere from 2 to 6 times body weight, which is huge. A lot of people don't realize, again, how much force, how much shock absorption is needed as you run. So just being well aware of single leg, 2 to 6 times your body weight. This is the reason why we include plyometrics and strength training, try to better prepare the body for those demands. Some of the characteristics that you need to be a successful runner: power or rate of force development, strength, endurance, stability, and balance are also huge from an efficiency standpoint. Can I land and hold my body in the right position to be as efficient as possible as a runner? And then can I do all this while withstanding 2 to 6 times body weight for who knows how many steps, how many miles on end, okay? And obviously running, very high rate of injury. Research shows anywhere from 30 to 70%, very big range, but leading towards a majority of runners suffering from some kind of running related injury each and every year. Awesome article here, and I think really good for our purposes to talk about what are some of the key areas that we need to address within the strength training program. You see a lot of different things thrown out there, and I think glute strengthening is one of those. Over the last 5 years or so, we're so fascinated on doing glute strengthening because, oh, the glutes are supposed to be strong and supposed to be powerful. But if we look at some of the research on how much force and contribution these muscles are playing towards the sport or the act of running, glutes are actually not one of the predominant muscles that contribute the most while running. They're super important from a propulsion standpoint. We want them to be powerful to push us off. We want the hip abductors, or glute medius and minimus, to help stabilize, maintain alignment of the leg and absorb force. But some of these other muscles, like the calf complex, specifically the soleus, hip flexors, quadriceps, and hamstrings, are really the key muscles that we want to develop to improve performance and reduce the risk of injury. So just kind of run through here. With this article, again, I don't want to run through the details. You can kind of look at the numbers and see, based on the speed that you're running, the demand on these muscles usually increases significantly the faster you run. So sprinters, and there's a lot more peak force and contribution from some of these muscles than distance runners. Okay. And if you're incorporating some kind of speed work, or you're introducing that for the first time, you need to be stronger and more resilient to withstand that degree of force. So iliopsoas muscle, hip flexors specifically, hamstrings, One, I mean, these two areas, as you go through that swing phase, as that leg, you push off, that leg swings through the air. That's where these muscles are very active to accelerate, bring that leg forward, decelerate before it hits the ground, and to put you in a good position as you land. Quad remains somewhat consistent. It's one of these key muscles that helps maintain our upright position from more of a postural standpoint. So it's consistent throughout running, kind of regardless of how fast you're going, but a very important muscle group to improve strength and resiliency in. And then, and most importantly, the calf, okay? Soleus muscle in particular. So if we think about the calf, we have two muscles. We have the gastroc muscle, which is the outermost. If you just reach down and touch your calf right now, kind of in the bulk of the muscle belly there, you're touching the gastroc muscle. Just a little bit deeper down in there is the soleus muscle. This is a muscle that tends to be neglected in most strength training programs. You have to target it in a specific way, which I'll talk about here. But a lot of people like to refer to it as the powerhouse of running. Okay, so making sure we address that, and I'll talk about that in a second. And then soleus, we think about this vertical force coming down, acting on the body as the body lands and as gravity pushes down. The soleus muscle in the calf is that main muscle that's helping push against those forces to help maintain our position. So very interesting here. Always think, if a lot of people think, what should I strengthen? Calf, soleus specifically, hip flexors, quadriceps, hamstrings, and then you start to sprinkle in these other things in terms of glute, upper body, core to kind of fill out your program. Important training principles, and this is what should kind of lay the foundation or the rules for your program. What should you follow in order to implement a well-structured program? First and foremost, specificity. The program needs to be specific in multiple ways. First and foremost, it is your specific to what your body needs and as an individual. So any weaknesses, any imbalances, what are your goals? How do I make this program fit what I need rather than just strength training to strength train? Making it specific so it's moving you towards that end result. Next thing is the demands of running, right? We know running is a very demanding single leg plyometric-like activity. Therefore, your program should, for the most part, be single leg plyometric-like, demanding with a lot of load, right? This is where a lot of people get into trouble that either incorporate a lot of machine-based training, maybe doing only body weight exercises, not jumping, not doing any heavy loaded strength training exercises or lifting or lifts, not as specific to the demands of running. So you'll see benefit with that. There's no reason why those things shouldn't be included in your program, but if you're neglecting these other pieces, then you'll see limited carryover to the sport. Progressive overload, very important, because we need to, just like a running plan, you're starting with your base mileage, you're progressing as you progressively overloading the body as you train for that goal race. There's no way, again, going from, if you think of the difference between being able to run 4 miles and training for 13, we need to bridge that gap. It's the same thing with strength training. We want to slowly and gradually increase the demand on the body, making it stronger, more powerful, more resilient to the demands of running to help meet and be successful at that mileage. So you can't just do the same thing over and over again. We can't just do the same 8 exercises, the same weight, the same repetitions for 3, 4, 5 months at a time and think, okay, I'm getting better. At a certain point, you're going to plateau if you're not following this progressive overload principle. Periodization, super important and often misunderstood when it comes to running. Runners do a great job, for the most part, following a very periodized running plan. If you have your goal races mixed in, you're going to have your base mileage, you're going to build up to prepare the body for that goal race. After that goal race, you might back down a little bit, maintain your base, but recover. And then you start to kind of continue that trend as you prepare for the next one. Strength training should kind of be the opposite here. And I'm going to actually show you that in a second and show you a graph to better understand how your strength training and running should work together to make sure we're not setting yourself up for injury because you're increasing total volume beyond what the body can handle. Variable loading. So like I mentioned before, we want to have this base. We want to be an athlete first and foremost, rather than a specialist. Okay, so this is what you'll see with a lot of youth athletes specifically these days. A lot of the college coaches are actually looking for athletes that play multiple sports first up into a certain age, and then they start to specialize in that college sport, because we're seeing a reduction in injury rates, better performance. They're better overall athletes that we can, and we have this bigger, wider foundation that we can attain then a higher peak. Runners sometimes, I know a lot of people tend to pick up running later in life. There are a lot of clients I work with that did run high school and in college, but mostly adult recreational runners that only run. We know that if you're only exposing your body to those specific demands, there's an increased risk of injury. So we want to add things like maybe playing tennis, or in your strength training program, moving laterally, rotating, playing soccer with the kids. I mean, there's so many different things you can do and move in multiple planes of motion to introduce different loads and different movements to the body, which will help reduce your overall risk of injury. And lastly, respect your injury history. Yes, strength training, primarily we want to improve performance, but there should be specific exercises within that program that target previous injuries in the process. Make sure that you kind of fully complete that rehabilitation for that injury, that tissue is tolerant to the demands of running. It's not going to come back in terms of a kind of a follow-up injury. A lot of people get to the point where they are out of pain and say, okay, I'm healthy to get back in there. Technically, the absence of pain does not mean that that injury is fully resolved. We need to continuously target that tissue, make it stronger, make it able to withstand the forces of running, and progress that program, that area appropriately to make sure these injuries don't come back in the future. So a second ago, I mentioned periodization, right? How to follow a periodized plan. No comments on the graph specifically. This is something I just threw together just to kind of depict this. So this is pretty much if someone was going to complete 2 goal races a year, and that does not mean you're only preparing for 2 specific races. You could have some other 5Ks, 10Ks, halves, Ragnar relays, those fun things mixed in here. But if you're trying to peak specifically for a spring goal race and a fall goal race, this is typically an outline or a structured program that you would follow in a very simplified way. So starting in January, again, some base miles there, you're at a good point to enter into your structured program. You're going to increase mileage as you get up to prepare for that goal race. Obviously, there might be drop weeks, recovery weeks, taper, all that stuff mixed in there, but very simplified approach. After you finish that goal race, you're going to reduce your mileage, focus a little bit more on recovery, letting the body properly recover and heal from that training over that 3-4 month period, and then maintaining your base again, getting ready for that next build for the fall goal race. So just kind of a general outline here. Strength training, though, should almost be exactly the opposite. The key thing to think about with periodization is we don't want to increase volume in both at the same time. The more we build in mileage and volume in strength training, the more total accumulative stress the body has to recover from. That typically sets yourself up to be more likely for an overuse injury. So as, say, this person here is building up for a spring goal race, their strength training volume is going to start to back down there just a little bit. Obviously, this depends highly on the individual. Some runners that have been working for a long time that have been incorporating strength training, they've been running since their teens or their 20s, we can get a little bit more aggressive with this and not back down as much because we know they can handle it. We've tried this process before and tried a specific kind of routine to test it out. But the best case scenario is as running mileage increases, strength training backs down in some way, whether that's the number of sets, repetitions, exercises, or the overall intensity of that session. Okay. As you get in, you can see this person completes their spring goal race here. We'll say April, May. As running mileage drops, then we will really want to kick things up a gear when it comes to strength training. We want to think about, were there any struggles as I build mileage for that last race? Any aches, any pains, any issues, any things I need to get on top of now to set myself up for success as I get into that next build for the race. So this is kind of just an overview. I recommend most people through the months and after that spring goal race, so usually May, June, getting into July possibly, they are hitting the strength training more. That's when we're really focusing on building a good foundation without worrying about running volume being high. And then also getting into October, November, December, after that fall goal race, before that January build or structured program is scheduled to start. That's when we hit things a little bit harder there for me as well. But obviously this year's been a little bit off. I've had a lot of people that races have gone virtual. They've decided, hey, I'm going to continue to build that foundation, hoping in the fall there actually will be something live that I can run. So we've kind of extended and increased that off season for this year specifically. So I want to take a second. Some of you that have been on these webinars before know I like to ask some questions, add some polls into here, see how well you've been paying attention, and maybe see what I can clarify along the way. So I'm going to launch a quick poll here. Take a second. I'm going to give you guys a few minutes to answer these questions. Question number 1, strength training helps to improve running economy, maximal reactive strength, velocity at maximal oxygen uptake, or all of the above. Your choice, best response there. Strength training is an effective strategy to address the risk factors associated with injury. Is that true or false? 3, the muscle that sees the highest peak forces while running is the soleus, hamstring, quadriceps, or glute maximus. Pick the best one there. And then lastly, running and strength training should follow a periodized schedule for the best results and longevity within the sport. Take a minute here. I'm going to wait till 80% of you complete this. I'm going to read through questions so far. Jennifer, I'm not sure why you have a black screen. I haven't heard from anyone else that said that same thing, so I would definitely try to jump off the webinar and get back on. That could help. Scott misunderstood what plyometrics are. Awesome. So we're going to touch on that in a second. Running on trails, talking about working the smaller muscles in the feet and ankles. Definitely. I think running on trails, you're definitely going to target the body in a different way. Some of these other stabilizers, because you're moving, you're jumping over sticks and rocks, and it's a little bit more variable than running on the road. So stability comes into play a lot more than that. Awesome. Thanks, Jennifer. And then Peter, how can I avoid a calf muscle pull around 11 mile when running the half marathon? Let me know more about that specifically. Is that something that happens every time at mile 11, or that's something that has only happened once and then that's it? So give me more information on that. We can talk about it. All right, guys. So done with the poll here. Strength training helps to improve. Yes, running economy. One person that said that, but all of the above. Strength training is an effective strategy to address the risk factors. That is true. That's one of the biggest benefits of strength training, to address those things that tend to break down and cause running related injury, even though we know we need to include a running retraining program in the process. 3, the muscle that sees the highest peak forces while running is correct. It is the soleus. A couple of you said quadriceps. Quadriceps remain pretty constant while running, regardless of speed. So definitely an important area, but soleus is the key one. Lastly, running and strength training should follow a periodized schedule. Just talked about that on the screen behind you. All right, nice job, guys. All right, guys, let's move on. Let's move into the main part of this content here. So we're going to touch on plyometrics first. I know, Scott, we've been messaging about plyometrics. You just had that question specifically about trail running. So hopefully this should clarify. So plyometric training will help to increase tendon stiffness, improve running economy, power, and speed, and increase or improve bone mineral density. So what we're looking at with plyometrics is some kind of jumping and landing exercise. You can see these people on the right. Not something I typically incorporate with a lot of my runners, box jumps, but jumping, landing, stabilizing, creating power, and absorbing the force on the way down. That's what we're talking about when we say plyometrics. Tendon stiffness is huge. We want the right balance between stiffness and flexible. We don't want to just be a stiff tendon that does not move, that joint is too tight, but we don't want something to be too flexible. This is why some of the research on static stretching and flexibility before sprinting, before high intensity exercise shows it's not favorable, because the more we stretch out that tendon, the less stiff it becomes, the less force we're able to produce as a result of that. Bone mineral density is something that's super important. One thing, like I mentioned, we tend to decline in terms of bone mineral density as we age, and running itself is actually a very neutral bone building sport. You don't see a lot of building or decline. It's kind of right in this neutral range. So adding some kind of jumping, landing, or heavy strength training to help preserve the strength and overall bone mineral content of the bones, especially in female runners, because we want to prevent, obviously, we want to offset bone stress reactions and stress fractures as much as possible, which are common in running. So where do plyometrics fit into this? I'm going to show you specific plyometrics in a second if you're still unsure what that means. Plyometrics should always be implemented after a thorough warm-up, because we're doing something that's a little bit more intense. It's a little faster, explosive type movement. We want to warm up thoroughly first and then implement plyometrics before we run. So it could be the last step of your dynamic warm-up before you get into running, which I recommend for a lot of runners, since we know as you run, you're gonna have to experience anywhere from 2 to 6 times your body weight. Adding some kind of jumping and landing exercise in the middle right there in that gray area is a good way to prepare the body for the demands of running and also see the benefits of plyometrics. And then also after a warm up and before your strength training, because these are explosive movements, we don't want to complete a lot of them. We want them to be low volume, high intensity, and we want to rest in between sets. The more we add a fatigue component, the less explosive these movements become and the less effective as well. So we're looking for low volume or low repetitions, high intensity. We're kind of getting off the ground as quickly as we can on some of these power-based plyometrics, and then enough rest in between sets that we can go ahead and we can just recreate that effort to the best of our ability. Obviously, if you're going out and you're running and you're going for regardless short or long run, you're adding plyometrics after the fact. Now we have to fight against this fatigue component, which no longer makes these as effective. Not saying don't do them, but they may not be the best use of your time at that point. And really reinforcing quality over quantity. Best way you can implement plyometrics, skipping. Did an awesome seminar earlier this year at the Running Lab. We talked about skipping and locomotion as one of those last steps before your run. A lot of people are starting either getting out of the car, just starting, they're walking for a few minutes, doing some kind of static stretching. Skipping is one of those that can fit as your warm-up or can fit as a plyometric-like activity, because as we look through some of these progressions of skipping, like the low skip, very running specific, pushing off, that quick push off, good rhythm, timing, coordination. It's a really good one to help reinforce running form in the process, depending on what you're focusing on and what your need is for the skipping and plyometrics. And this one here, low skips going forward and backwards, so a little bit more variable, different than running. Obviously running straight forward, adding a backward component in here. A lot of my runners will actually implement lateral skipping, lateral skips or crossover, a lot of different variations of skipping to work on that kind of quick push off from the calf and the ankle, timing, coordination, shock absorption. You can get it a lot from skipping. Next up, increasing the intensity. So this is a simple progression that you could run through. A skips, obviously a larger range of motion than the low skips. My knees are coming up about waist height. Nice big arm swing, opposite arm, opposite leg, and I'm driving down forcefully into the ground to create that power. So creating good stiffness from the tendon, getting those muscles to be nice, quick, and responsive to that foot contact. And then lastly, we have power skips, looking a little bit more at vertical height. I'm kind of doing this a little bit more leisurely here instead of exploding as high as possible, but a good starting point to work on that motion, opposite arm and opposite leg, driving strong into the ground, creating power, and then trying to explode up towards the ceiling as high as I can. So when in doubt, the most simple starting point is to make sure you're doing some kind of skipping. After your warm up, before your run, take a minute or two, add some of these skips in there. Skipping anywhere from 15 to 20 feet, moving through multiple repetitions, or adding this before your strength training workout will be a good prep for some of these lower body movements, plyometric movements, and strength training. All right, so I like to that was kind of a separate category of plyometrics, but I like to categorize traditional plyometrics into landing-based and power-based. So with landing-based plyometrics, we're not so much focused on getting as high as possible into the air. We're focusing on our landing. Are we absorbing force well? Are we stable and controlled, especially as we get to some of these single leg variations? This is a good thing for those that have poor stability and poor balance. This is a good starting point. I always tell people it's better to learn how to decelerate than to accelerate. We want to teach the body how to control itself in space first before we work on moving as fast as possible. It's kind of like the car that has old brakes that doesn't stop well. we probably don't want to take that car into the racetrack or take it on the highway and start racing people, right? It's a little bit unsafe. There's a lot more risk for injury, risk for crash. Power-based plyometrics, this is actually working on your speed, your quickness, your tendon stiffness, and what I mentioned earlier, rate of force development. So this addresses explosiveness, propulsion, that push-off phase of running, and then, like I said, tendon stiffness. We want the right amount of stiffness in the tendon, so as we land, we store energy, and then as we push off, we already have that energy storage there that we can release to help improve efficiency, improve running economy in the process. So just to run through a few landing-based plyometrics, just some simple ones here. I think you'll be surprised. These things are super simple. There are a lot of different plyometrics you can include. I think people tend to overcomplicate a lot of these. With talking about a body weight sport like running, we want to do the simple things very well. So first one, vertical jump and stick. I'm just teaching myself on 2 legs. It's a simple kind of a teaching tool, this one, more than anything else. How can I jump, push off, land, absorb force, and dissipate that force among the soft tissue and tendons, more so than landing abruptly into the bones. One thing you'll see with some runners is they don't do a good job absorbing force, so very stiff into the lower extremity. The stiffer you are, the more force that's going to act up that leg. So we're just teaching you how to land and absorb that force and to dissipate it. Okay. Obviously, with this one being on 2 legs, I don't show the front view straight on. I want to make sure knee alignment is also good, so I'm not letting those knees collapse and I'm not too wide, but I'm aligned between the ankles and hips. Now, as we progress through some of these landing-based plyometrics, always want to get on one leg as much as possible. Like I mentioned, running is a single leg plyometric-like activity, so this is kind of where the gold is when it comes to plyometrics and landing-based specifically. Single leg ones, now we're tying in balance and stability into the mix here. That's what we really need to develop in terms of running to be efficient, to maintain our position and alignment. The more we lose alignment, lose our balance in a controlled exercise like this, the more some of these other bigger muscles have to work as you run to make sure they're controlling you, because the stabilizers aren't working as well. So single leg vertical jump and stick, jumping, landing softly, absorbing still like that original exercise, vertical jump one on 2 legs, bending into the ankle, knee, and hip, aligning the knee and trying to maintain levelness at the pelvis. So looks easy. I probably warmed up and did a few before I did this video, but it's a very challenging exercise and something that most people need to work on from a stability standpoint. From there, we've spoken about variable loading. I do like to add lateral jumps into the mix, getting a little bit different demand on the hip joint, hip abductors, adductors. Good exercise here, medial lateral jumps. You can see I'm just jumping kind of over that plus on the ground, but now making sure I'm preventing my body from falling over that leg as I jump and land to create stability and shock absorption. With this one, I like to increase distance or intensity of that jump. So as you can maintain that landing and land in a good position, you're going to work on jumping a little bit wider, a little bit wider, a little bit higher. You can increase some of those factors to make it a little bit more challenging, a little bit more force on the lower extremity. Okay, so now if we switch gears to power-based plyometrics, and I'll kind of talk about sets and reps and everything in a second on all of these. Power-based plyometrics, like I mentioned, propulsion, explosiveness, rate of force development, and just really placing a greater demand or load on the lower extremity. First up here, we have ankle hops. Nice, quick, rhythmic jumps. And you see not a lot of jumps here. You could probably do this for a minute or two and do well, most runners. However, we're looking for minimizing fatigue and getting as high as possible. So as soon as you land and hit the ground, I want you to get up as high as you can, land quickly, get back up. So you're trying to be on the ground as little as possible and work on that power component. Very simple starting exercise, good progression for those that have suffered from plantar fascia issues, Achilles tendinopathy, calf strains in the past, going through that rehab process to strengthen, and then adding this as a kind of a last step. Next up, squat jumps, something most people have heard of or tried, usually in a strength training sense, in a strength training program. A lot of group exercise classes includes these. Biggest thing about squat jumps, now we start to introduce more range of motion to the mix. We don't, because of the demands of running, there's not a whole lot of range of motion, especially at the knee or the hip, required to run. So I always recommend not going so low into your jump. Don't land and lower into a full squat. Lower about a quarter away or half of the way down and focus on getting up into the air quickly. That's the key thing you want to focus on, which is what's called the amortization phase. It's the time between landing and jumping. We want to minimize that for all of this stuff to carry over to faster running speed and explosiveness. Okay. And then lastly here, bounds. Bounds are a two-legged jump for distance. So a little bit more specific to running, obviously on two legs compared to one, but thought it would be a very good starting point for most people who are not incorporating these. Now, horizontally, I'm driving, really pushing the body and pushing the legs behind me, exploding to get that good hip extension, driving from the ankle. But on all of these plyometrics, whether you're doing the landing-based ones or power-based ones, you really want to focus on, again, like I mentioned, low repetitions, anywhere from, I would say, 5 repetitions is kind of a good place to be for these, and then take your time, rest. Okay, doing 2 to 3 sets, 2 to 4 sets. For some of these, I actually include them in my dynamic warm-up. I'll do a set or 2, or I'll add 2 different ones. Like I'll do single leg vertical jump and stick, and then I'll add some ankle hops, and then I'll get into my run from there. So incorporating different pieces between landing base and power base can be good, but always emphasizing the control and the quality of the landing base first before you get into power based. We want the quality first before we get into some of these explosive movements. Okay, so now if we switch gears just a little bit and talk on some of these specific strength training exercises. Strength training, obviously, some of the improvements that you'll see and some of the benefits, and we can do a good job of targeting those underlying risk factors that are associated with injury. So whether it is overpronation or poor pelvic control, knee valgus, whatever it is, we can address that within the strength training program, which I highly recommend. And a lot of people doing these general strength training programs is a good starting point. It's always good to build strength, build stability and balance, but getting as specific as possible is really the key to making these things carry over and then reduce your risk of injury long-term. Obviously with strength training, depending on the repetition range and the focus of the exercise, we can improve things like strength, endurance, stability, and balance. And then I have something blocking here. And then improving running economy and speed in the process with these exercises, if programmed properly, and we'll talk about that. Okay, so I like to break the strength training down into 2 categories: primary exercises and accessory exercises. Your primary exercises are like your main lift. This is the biggest, most taxing lift of the workout, where we're gonna do lower repetitions, higher resistance, and then allow longer periods of rest in between. Okay, so we're trying to actually develop strength, power, and add a degree of load on the body with these. And then we have accessory exercises. And these, we're still developing strength and endurance, but there's a little bit more emphasis on stability, balance, neuromuscular control. This is a little bit higher up in the repetition range, 8 to 15 reps. And because it's higher reps and less weight, you typically don't need to rest as much in the process. So a couple of good primary exercises, and this all depends on where you are completing your strength training program. Some of you that are doing this at home, if you have dumbbells or some kind of resistance, this is great. At the gym, you can definitely do this. If you're a body weight, you probably want to skip. You can't really, it's not as effective doing these primary exercises because you can't load it as much. So I usually use them as a teaching tool. Let's teach these movements in these positions, and then let's move on to some of these other single leg exercises. But just to give you some examples, first and foremost here, we have the squat. Squat is a great knee dominant movement where we can hold a dumbbell, we can hold a barbell, we can add some load on the system that we're sinking into the squat position. This one is actually performed with tempo. So I think 1, 2, 3 seconds down, and then a quicker, more explosive push up. So those are some of the variables that you can kind of manipulate to make it harder or to fit more of a power demand is the tempo. What I would want to do here as much as possible is if I was performing a squat, make sure I have enough resistance to make it challenging. Again, body weight is good, but usually more of a teaching tool, in my opinion, body weight, because you need to perform a lot of reps to actually make that challenging. So you would plateau rather quickly. Being able to go from a dumbbell, like I did a second ago in the goblet position, holding under the chin, to then progressing to a barbell. Again, a little bit more intimidating for people, but I find that if you take your time to actually progress through goblet squats, you're going from 15 to 20, 25, 30, 45. Once you get to 45, that's the weight of the bar. Let's move over to the bar. Let's hold it up here. It's not as hard on the upper body to hold. Now it's on the shoulders. We can add more load in an actually loaded way, which helps stimulate bigger muscle groups for strength, power, bone, and tendon health. Okay. Next up, we have the deadlift. Deadlift is a little bit more of a hip hinge type pattern. You can see here, comparing the bottom movement to the top movement, my chest is actually facing down to the ground to a greater degree, and I'm driving forward throughout the hips. So getting more posterior chain, your spinal erectors, your glutes, your hamstrings. Same thing you can complete with dumbbells to get started with. Actually, an exercise that I like to teach people to make sure they can do regardless of what they have for resistance, but then loading if we have access to it. From there, we do the same thing with the barbell, adding more resistance onto the bar, good pull, actually load again. It's pulling the body straight down to add these compressive forces, which helps stimulate bone growth, but a good exercise to really work on posterior chain strength. And traditional deadlift, get a lot of quadriceps in there as well. So with these exercises, low repetitions, anywhere from 2 to 6. I start people higher in that range or in 6 repetitions because the weight's going to be a little bit lighter. As we know, form is good and they're doing the lift properly. We're going to increase resistance, drop repetitions. So an exercise that could potentially get pretty heavy in the process. Now, some of the accessory movements. The best movement really for running is a step up. You can't go wrong performing some kind of step up. Still building strength, endurance around a lot of the key muscles, glutes, hamstring, quad. And then we have this big stability component. We have to control the position of the foot, the hip, the pelvis. And the top one here, I'm performing the goblet step up, which is holding that weight to the chest. I find holding the weight here on the step up to start acts as a good counterbalance that you can control down better than just falling. This bench actually is a little bit high. I like to start runners lower. Running, there's not a whole lot of range of motion at the knee or the hip happening here throughout that stance phase. So anything like the first or second step at home is usually enough. And if you can do that well, just add some weight to it if you have it. Okay. Progressing that, we can progress to 2 dumbbells. We can move laterally, which I like because now we're challenging the hips and the stabilizers in a slightly different position. Instead of moving forward and backward, I have this small lateral component, which makes the abductors and adductors work harder. So this is just a simple demonstration of how to progress and time that step up to make it a little bit more challenging. At the bottom, we have our split squat. I like to start people more stationary on their lunges and lunge exercises because it provides the environment where we're more stable. And we don't have to worry about stepping. Am I stepping in the right position? Am I stepping far enough? Am I stepping too short? Do I have to control this in a dynamic environment? You're setting up your position properly, and then you're executing the exercise. So I'm making sure my pelvis is level, my knees are in line between my second toe and my hips. So I have good alignment and good setup throughout this. And then I'm just trying to add some resistance to really load that front leg as much as I can. Very good exercise and progression for runners. Now a little bit more single leg focused. Back leg is elevated, but it's almost more so as a support leg than a leg that's driving up. So you're shifting weight to that front leg, probably about 70, 80%. More balance and stability required, and then going through this range of motion to strengthen that right leg. So strength, endurance, balance, and stability, all of that. Always recommend the split squat first. Rear foot elevated split squat is this variation. And then from there, I usually take people into a lot of the different lunging variations at that point. So variable loading was something that I introduced in the beginning, making sure we're moving in multiple planes of motion, not just always doing something that's specific to running, and we need that to a degree, but trying to break out of that. These 2 exercises are good that are a little bit more hip glute focused, but glutes as, again, the top one, lateral toe tap, glute as a stabilization muscle. So if we look at lateral toe taps, small hip hinge or small bend in the knee, small bend in the hips. And then you can see as I stretch that band and reach that leg out to the side, it's not really touching the ground. I'm not bearing weight on that. I'm just reaching and stretching the band because I'm trying to use that band to try to pull that knee inward. I'm trying to prevent, at the same point, maintain alignment of the leg, really activate the hip and the foot to maintain proper stability. So not a super hard strength training exercise, but something super valuable that works on a lot of the key risk factors: pelvic position, alignment of the leg, and then stability of the foot. Okay. You can progress that by just sliding the band down. A lot of the research shows that hip neuromuscular activation and kind of EMG activity of the hip increases if you put the band actually around the ankle instead of the knees. So I'm not saying just do that because it's the best way and you feel the hip more. Start at the knees, perfect that, and then move to the ankles to get better activation of the hips. Okay, lateral squat. This is a great exercise. A lot of people are jumping into lateral lunge because lateral squat's a little bit more awkward and something you don't see programmed as much. Now we're really preaching variable loading, moving into the frontal plane, which is these lateral based movements. Good to preserve flexibility around the hips Again, we only need so much, but I think we still want to and do other things throughout our daily life rather than just run and be able to reach down to the ground, move laterally, pick up kids. So this is a really good exercise that helps preserve hip flexibility and then also loads glutes, hip abductors with the lateral squat. Simple progression of that. If we add a single dumbbell, going from body weight here, we can actually add some good load to this exercise, which we should. But targeting these muscles build up overall strength and endurance of the lower extremity. Obviously, you can't go wrong adding some kind of hip bridge variation, but like I mentioned when we covered that research study earlier, the hip flexors and the hamstrings are, we look at the peak muscle forces, actually experience more forces than the glute. So adding some kind of glute strengthening exercise, but starting to tie in hip flexor and hamstring into the mix. This first one, if you notice, there's a band right around my feet there. So I'm performing a traditional hip bridge with marching, but I'm adding a band on my feet. So as I pull that leg up, I have to engage the hip flexor to pull up into that resistance. I'm sure you can see my hands right there, trying to maintain levelness of my pelvis and core engagement, stability at the hips, and then strengthening the hip flexors in the process. Very specific to running. As you push off with one leg, the other leg is swinging through, hip flexors engaging to pull that leg through. Very specific exercise to the running cycle. Next up here, still another band around the feet. Now I'm going to lengthen the legs out. See how much further away the legs are in this one, the heels in relation to the butt. Traditional hip bridges, you're a lot closer. Long lever bridges, you have this longer lever, longer lever. So here I'm getting the hamstrings to a greater degree. So now a little bit more emphasis on hamstring strength with hip flexor strength, still getting the glutes, spine erectors and those muscles, but a very good variation of hip bridging, which is a little bit more glute focused to be more specific to the demands of running. And obviously marching motion here, you can't go wrong. Whenever a leg is lifting, opposite arm and opposite leg move together, really good for rhythm and coordination. Okay, loaded marching exercises. So a little bit non-traditional here, something that's come up more so 10 years, but really good for runners, add good load in the hands and more of an upright dynamic stability exercise. So working a lot of these core stabilization muscles to maintain posture and position, but then at the same point, balance and stability. I actually like to use this exercise if you look at the position as I strike my foot down. Those people that are really aggressive overstriders and heel strikers, not saying that heel striking is the devil's, more overstriding that's the issue, but retraining that foot strike to land underneath the knee as I step straight down and then strike a little bit more forefoot, help retrain the running mechanics in the process. But something that wants you to add as much load and resistance as you can. I typically get my women to holding at some point because we usually lose grip strength more quickly than just overall difficulty of the exercise. So put a weighted vest on, we hold dumbbells, 35, sometimes 40 pounds. A lot of guys can hold 65, 70 pounds on this one and really work on maintaining and preventing that sway, stable, aligned, balanced, foot stability, hip stability. A lot of key things going on here. Another good one, just adding a single dumbbell. So obviously that dumbbell is going to pull you down to one side. You need to use that lateral core, use that hip abductor to make sure you're maintaining a good position. This one, obviously, I'm not working on foot strike as much. You can see I'm just coming down, focusing more so on the core in the stability aspect because I'm just kind of landing down, heel strike right there in front of the body. So depending on your purpose, what you need, trying to tie some of these running issues into your strength training program, we can add different foot strikes and things into these loaded drills. Like I mentioned with some of the research earlier, the calf and the gastroc soleus complex specifically is an area that you really need to target within your strength training program. So the gastroc is this outermost calf muscles, which you can target with traditional calf raises. I see a lot of runners that are doing a good job performing a calf raise exercise. Unfortunately, been bilateral calf raises on two legs compared to some of these single leg variations are not as effective. The active running is just so demanding that I think doing it on two legs is a good starting point. Teach that strength, that endurance, control the position of the foot so you're not rolling around too much, and then go to single leg as quickly as you can. Okay, so single leg, more specific to the demands. You can see here I got a friend and physical therapist, Chris Wolf, at the bottom demonstrating that one. Driving up on a single leg, leaning to the wall, not really focused on balance and stability as much. We want to lean towards the wall, drive up, hold for a second, control down. We could also add in a greater degree of range of motion at the ankle joint, because ankle dorsiflexion, and specifically that position at the bottom where the ankle is flexed, is something we need for proper running mechanics. This helps move the ankle through a greater range of motion to build strength and resilience at the calf, Achilles tendon, plantar fascia, but also hopefully preserve or improve range of motion and flexibility in the process. However, yes, doing calf exercises, single leg ones are important. We want to perform some of these soleus specific exercises. So you can see these are some variations that are a little bit more uncommon in strength training programs. With this first one here, I'm performing a wall sit exercise. Obviously, the lower I go, the harder this will be on the lower extremities, more load, but I'm lifting the heels off the ground. So I'm performing a calf raise as I hold the wall sit. We know that to target the soleus muscle, you need to be in a slightly knee bent position. And that's what we're getting here to target that muscle specifically, because we know that's the powerhouse of running. That's something that requires or sees the most peak forces. And then we can progress that. So you can see bringing the feet together, still in that wall sit position, but now going single leg. Tricky exercise, actually, a little bit more surprising than it looks with how challenging it is. Going to single leg, so now all our weight is coming down. I'm using that soleus muscle, but I'm alternating one leg to the other to add more force into that muscle. So we're trying to get you guys wrapped up in the next couple of minutes here, probably about 2 minutes or so. At the end, making sure, again, we're filling in the gaps with some other exercises. We don't just always focus on only lower extremity. I like to make my programs full body, but obviously due to time, we can't get to everything. A couple of good full or upper body strengthening exercises, dumbbell bent over row. You can't go wrong working on posture, improving upper back strength, getting the shoulders, again, releasing some from the pec, delt, opening up and getting more strength through the middle and upper trap. So dumbbell rowing at the bottom, a little bit more specific. You can start to intertwine some of these things with single leg balance exercises, single leg static row there. Hard to see, but you can see my other foot is kind of floating in the air. So I'm standing on my left leg, my right arm is rowing and vice versa. And then always making sure you fill in some of these key core exercises. We don't need to go crazy in terms of core, but the stability side of the core is what we need. So dead bugs, maintaining the position rather than going through flexion, extension, rotation. The core doesn't do a whole lot as you run. And I did do a whole webinar on this. So if this is an area that you want to dive into more, I'm happy to send you that webinar as well. Feel free to shoot a comment in there and I'll pass that along to you tomorrow. But dead bugs, side planks, single leg side planks, Palloff press, not necessarily flexing and extending, Supermans and all that, and crunches. Those are good for specific people depending on weakness and limitation. Like to take a stability first approach. So feel free, take a screenshot of this slide. This is a very a simple sample program that I put together based specifically on the exercises. Every one of these exercises is in this webinar and also on my YouTube channel. So you're welcome to, again, look at those specifically. This would be a very good program to follow. We do still have some of those upper body ones at the bottom. We're looking at plyometrics, primary exercises, accessory exercises, and puts it together in a good sequence for you to follow moving forward. So let's kind of start getting wrapped up here. Last quick poll, couple questions. We're going to get through here and then wrap up this webinar. So a couple questions for you guys here as we start to wrap up. Plyometrics should be programmed where within your strength training and running program? Should it be early when you are fresh, after, so there's an element of fatigue, or it doesn't matter? 2, ankle hops are a form of what kind of plyometrics? Is it landing based or power based? 3, the blank and blank are 2 exercises used to increase maximal strength. So think back to, and you might see behind here, behind this poll, what type of primary exercises? Lastly, due to high peak force, muscle force at the specific region of the body, the blank exercise might be one of the most valuable for runners. Is it the step up, calf raise, lateral toe tap, or loaded marching? Your choice here. So let's have you guys fill in here. We're going to wait till we get to about 80%, probably be 30 seconds or so. I'll look to see what question we have. All right, so Jessica had a great question as I disrupt your thinking here. What are your thoughts on box jumps and jumping rope as addition to strength training? Awesome. I don't do a lot of box jumps. There's too much of a fear component to it. And I feel the people that do better at box jumps are not always the most powerful and better at jumping. They can lift their legs up more quickly to meet the box rather than jump to the box. I've done them a lot in the past and programmed them for runners, but not so much anymore. Jumping rope is awesome. Obviously, yes, plyometric, bigger degree of fatigue involved in that, but I think you can't go wrong. You're obviously not working specifically on power. I would kind of make it power endurance or speed endurance. It's kind of some of those characteristics that you'll build from that, but you can't go wrong jumping rope. All right, guys, so let's wrap up here. Share these results. Plyometrics should be programmed early when you are fresh. That is correct. Technically, yes, you can do them anytime you want to, but if you want them to translate over to speed, rate of force development, and explosiveness, they should be done early on. Ankle hops are a form of, that should be power-based. Landing quickly, exploding from the ankles, there's not really much of a landing component to that. It's more so quickness getting off the ground. And then the blank and blank are 2 exercises used to increase maximal strength and power. So 2 answers on that one, correct: squat and deadlift, okay? So A and D. And then lastly, due to high peak forces, we're talking about the calf and the soleus muscle specifically. So that would be the calf raise exercise. Okay, so where do you go from here? Let's start to wrap up. I know we're a couple minutes over and I apologize about that. Where do you go from here? So always understand you specifically, what does your body need? What injuries have you experienced in the past? Where are your weak links? Usually we know this to a degree. I see a lot of people as I get it run through testing, like, yeah, I always knew my left side, my left hip felt weaker, my left hamstring cramps or whatever, but we're just kind of sometimes unsure what to do about it. So understand the key demands of the sport and your individual weak links, because that will put you on a path to see the best results with your running. Follow key training principles. So specificity, progressive overload, periodization, and variable loading. I want you to really consider these things. Look at your current program. If you're incorporating strength training and plyometrics, think about, am I really including these principles as the foundation for my program? If I'm not, how can I do better? Or if you're starting from scratch here, these are some things you want to think about. If you've been injured in the past, don't shy away from that area. Load that area as best you can. Obviously, depends on where you are in that rehab process. If it's a new injury, you might need to take stress away from that, and then build back up. There's usually never an instance when it comes to injury and running that we want to offload that area completely and then get back into running. We want to offload that area, minimize stress, minimize pain, and then from there, load to meet the demands of running. So don't be afraid to really stress that area in a smart and progressive way. Again, don't be afraid to lift heavy weights and jump. Running 2 to 6 times body weight, plyometric we need these things to be more successful out on the road or trail. So heavier exercises, lower repetitions. Like I said, 2 to 6 repetitions in those primary lifts. Adding some resistance to those. Obviously, form is key. We don't just jump into those things. We take our time to make sure we're doing them properly and then make them more challenging. Be consistent for a minimum of 6 to 12 months. Fortunately, this is not one of those strategies that you could just do here and there and see results. You have to do it on a consistent basis. Most of my runners are strength training, depending on the time of year, anywhere from 1 to 4 times a week. And we're doing that for an extended period of time. It takes you about 4 to 8 weeks to the neuromuscular system just become efficient before you start to actually improve strength, power, and some of these other characteristics. So we're talking about 2 months before you actually see these reliable results. So stay committed long-term, because that will be the best for your running. Results more realistic with good running mechanics. We'll be covering that next in the next webinar. So make sure we're running more efficiently in the process. We're not just going to strength train, be stronger, more powerful. If you can't express it while you run, there's not as much carryover as much as most people believe. So be a better runner in the process. That's the end goal. All right, guys. So as we wrap up here, I'm going to enter names into the raffle. Like I mentioned, 1 free month in the Healthy Running Program. What we're going to do here is a virtual assessment, running analysis, movement assessment, evaluation. Determine what you specifically need based on your goals, based on your injury history, based on that evaluation, and then create you a specific program moving forward. So if you are interested in entering the raffle, let's put this up here. All you need to do to enter into the raffle is to answer the questions. 1, do you want to enter the raffle for 1 free month in the Healthy Running Program? Yes or no, your choice. I'm not going to enter you into the raffle and reduce the chance of everyone else if you're not interested or if you're already covered here with your own strength training program. And then second question, just something I offer to everyone. I spend a lot of time just talking to people. If you need help, if you have specific questions, if you want more clarification based on what we talked about today, if you want to send me your program and say, hey, this is my program, how can I do better? I'm happy to schedule a call with you to discuss that. I usually do this via Zoom, run people through tests, give feedback on their program specifically, usually completely free of charge. Just try to help provide value, put you on the right track as best you can. So nothing you have to pay for or nothing I want to sell you on in the process. So take a second. We're going to wait to get a couple more votes in. Awesome. See if we get one more. Perfect. All right, guys. So expect an email tomorrow. I think I said 12 earlier, 11 a.m. Eastern time. You'll be getting our email that has the webinar replay, the winner of the raffle, a link for the next webinar if you want to join us on running mechanics. That will tie everything together. Make sure look in your spam folder as always. It'll be coming from MailChimp, my newsletter software. So sometimes it ends up in there. Make sure you check that. Any questions as we wrap up? I know it's late. I'm going to answer a couple questions from the sign up and registration process, and welcome to add a question in there right now at this point, and we'll get to that. We can talk about that for a second. So Patty, how to improve running form through specific exercises. You need to understand where the breakdown is in terms of your running form. So what is going on? What is the issue? And if we don't know how well you run, we can't really say what exercise is specific to that. You cannot go wrong with any kind of single leg balance exercises, your step ups, your split squats, lateral toe taps, adding in the marching exercise, even without weight, looking at marching from point A to point B, adding a pair of dumbbells to it, skipping. I mean, those are the things that are the most specific to running. However, we'd have to look at your running to see what was going on, where you were breaking down, to determine what the best exercises would be. Julie asked about the prevention of hamstring re-injury. Hamstrings are a common area to be injured, either hamstring strains or hamstring tendinopathy. So one recommendation I like, I showed you the long lever bridge with marching. If you just did standard long lever bridges, or if you used some kind of ball curl progression, so supine ball curls, single leg eccentric ball curls, is the best way that you can load into the hamstring. Romanian deadlift exercises, single leg deadlift exercises. The key for the hamstring specifically is to, how do I load, build strength, build endurance in the hamstring, but teach it to be more resilient as it moves eccentrically. What we know about running, and especially as the faster you run, if you're introducing some kind of speed work, tempo runs, track workouts, those things into the mix, the hamstrings are more involved to decelerate the leg as the leg comes forward before it strikes the ground again. So the hamstrings need to be super strong. I see a lot of people suffering from hamstring issues. Beth, wondering about dosage. So I think I talked well about how many sets and repetitions of these things. Typically plyometrics, 2 to 3 sets, low repetitions, about 5 and 4 to 6 repetitions of them. These strength training can range. Your primary exercise, your heavier lifts could be anywhere from 3 to 6 sets of 2 to 6 repetitions. And then as you get into your accessory ones, usually do about 2 to 3 sets of 8 to 15 reps. I would try to make sure you're strength training at minimum once per week. Research shows that if you maintain once per week, you're allowed to maintain some of those gains. You're not going to improve a whole lot, but as you get higher in your mileage, you probably want to back down your strength training to about once, twice per week. But if you're in the off-season period, anywhere from 2 to 4, depending on how much you're actually running in that period. Any other questions? So Yukio, where's the best place to get evaluated for a running injury? Depends on where you are. So Chicago, so you want to go to some kind of sports medicine orthopedist. I would probably go to physical therapy first, physical therapy or a sports chiropractor, depending on their specialty and their focus. But definitely physical therapy. I think you can get a good, well-rounded evaluation. They should be evaluating you, should be putting you on the treadmill, again, depending on if you can run at this point or if it's painful. But I would definitely, I would consider physical therapy depending on, I don't know, Illinois as far as physical therapy as the first step. I know some states are different depending on if you need a referral from a physician or not. But physical therapy, athletic trainer, sports chiropractor, and then doctor would probably be one of my next suggestions depending on the severity of the injury. Any other questions? Got a couple people hanging out here. Any last question before we wrap up? I just want to say I appreciate you guys for being here on your Sunday. Sorry, I went a little bit long, but I appreciate it. All right, so let's get, if we have one more question to get in. Thank you, Sharon. As we wrap up here. Thank you. All right, thank you guys. I appreciate you joining us today. Let me know any questions. For those of you that want to schedule a discovery call, we'll talk this week, figure out how we can fine tune things, give you a little bit more insight. But I'll be emailing you tomorrow about the raffle. Check that at 11 a.m. Eastern time. And I hope you guys have a great Sunday, since the weather here at least is beautiful. Thanks, guys.